The chlorine stung like a clean lie. Children's laughter hit the undersides of the afternoon like bells. Sun broke on wet skin and on a bright red swimsuit that had been chosen because it made her son grin. Then came the sharp, impossible sound of a wrist snapping into cold metal. The sound cut through the noise, metal on metal, more final than any sentence she'd heard in courtrooms or back rooms. A small, clear baggie, its contents pale and suspicious-looking, dangled at arm's length from a glove-covered hand, held up for the entire pool deck to judge. Phones rose like a flock of birds. A child screamed at the back of his throat, the pitch of disbelief, and her own boy's face folded open into a wet, wordless sound of betrayal. She had been sitting on the edge of the pool when it happened, her toes drawing cold circles in the water. The day had been ordinary in the way that matters most. Sunscreen, a paper cup of something too sweet, and the thin, gilded armor of pretending not to be anyone but a mother for a few hours. The officers did not seem like an intrusion until they were an avalanche. Two dark uniforms cutting across the sun-dazzled deck, badges flat and blunt, voices low but hard enough to sharpen the air. "Ma'am, we need you to step out of the water." She had stepped out because of the boy who had latched to her side, because he was small, and he trusted her. She had offered a tired smile to old men at the card table, mouthed a hello to busy mothers, adjusted the towel around her shoulders. That's when one officer, young, mouth too quick, had reached for the bag at the base of her tote and produced it like a conjurer revealing the rabbit. Accusation is an art, and he painted the canvas without asking. "You're under arrest for possession with intent," he said, as if reading from a script. Intent, in the hands of strangers shouting over chlorine and sunscreen, squinted into something monstrous and wide that swallowed her backstory whole. The crowd murmured and then sharpened, cameras clicked, and beneath it all roared the one animal sound she could never tame: her son's crying. She did not fight at first. The metal bit into her wrists in a way that made it impossible not to feel ridiculous. Her hands in front of the scrubbed pool deck, acting like a criminal while the water threw sunlight up at everyone, indifferent. People whispered. A woman pressed her phone too near to her face to catch a better angle. Someone said the slow, terrible word, "dealer," and someone else laughed like a judge. What she felt then was not anger in its polished form. It was a peculiar private grief that rose in her like heat. Years of training told her what to do. Stay calm, observe tone, watch for witnesses. But this scene had been written by ignorance and fed by bias, and none of her rehearsals had prepared her for the rawness of her 9-year-old's panic. His little arms clung to her thigh, as if by holding on he could glue things back together. His name, which she had called out to coax him to swim a half-hour before, tasted suddenly like something she could choke on. The baggie became a totem, a talisman of accusation. It was small, a laughable thing against her wrists, but it wielded a power far larger than its size. The officer's eyes had the flat glaze of someone whose job had taught him to stop looking at people as anything but blurs, threat, suspect, neutral object. He did not know her. He did not know the lives folded up under the red swimsuit, or that she had walked into rooms where men in suits sweat into their collars and stammered on the wrong side of rage. He only cared about two things in that moment: the evidence in his palm and the crowd's need for clarity. There was a fleck of something that glittered under the sun, a tiny white smudge against the plastic. The officer's partner barked for more restraint. The younger officer's voice was iron, with a need to be seen doing the right thing. Someone in the crowd hissed that justice at the pool was overdue. No one spoke the word that threaded everything together: racism. but it hovered like pollen, inevitable and unseen. The first minutes were a blur of things that felt as brittle as glass. Shouts, the gut punch of watching her phone fill with unknown numbers, the thin, bright sting of being filmed by a dozen strangers who would soon become witnesses with no context. She thought of being seen by the wrong kind of eye and realized, with a cold flourish, that in that moment she had become a cautionary tale for 1,000 minds. The air tasted of sun and salt, and the metallic tang of humiliation. She kept her mouth closed. Her son's sobs scraped at her like wind. She placed one hand over the top of his little fist and felt the tremor of him wanting to be told this was a mistake that would pass quickly, like a bruise. Instead, the scene hardened into an accusation that would not be easily erased. Phones recorded. Voices called for answers. People had already decided they'd seen the whole truth because the evidence fit the picture they needed. She had to make a choice in that second that felt like an incision. Would she explode? Would she call out everything she was, every badge and scar she carried, and risk that the spectacle would become worse for the boy clutching her leg? Or would she stay quiet, let the scene play out, and become a different kind of witness to herself? She closed her eyes for a breath long enough to remember the lines of her mother's face, and the lesson that had threaded through her life like a seam. Keep your son safe, even if it means taking blows meant for you. The camera lenses kept turning. The officers moved like actors accustomed to applause, certain they were the good parts in the script of the world. No one noticed the way her mouth shaped the name of a phone number she would return in private, the way her mind catalogued the face of the officer who had reached into her bag with hands that never hesitated. People would later call the scene many things: viral, outrageous, an unfortunate misunderstanding. But in that first coppery minute, what it felt like was small and sharp and human. The rupture between how someone was perceived and the truth of the life they carried with them. The pool dissolved into a stage. Her son's sobs became the drumbeat she would march to for the rest of the story. Her name, if anyone cared to know it, was not yet a headline. She was, in that moment, only a woman in a red swimsuit and a boy whose quiet trust was crumpling. That simple truth was all the world needed to compound the injustice it was about to engineer. Her son's eyes met hers and asked the question of her she could not answer aloud. Who would stand with us? She tightened her jaw and let the world spin itself into narrative. What came next would not be simple. It would not be only about a bag or a misunderstanding. It would drag old ghosts into bright daylight and make a choice between two truths, one that lived in the rooms where men in suits traded favors, and one that lived in the clean, stubborn light of a mother's love. She had learned, a long time ago, how to hold both kinds of fire at once. She let the cameras roll. Her name was Maya Bennett. She had lived enough lives to know how to speak in men's hearing without breaking, how to turn a word into a weapon, and, when necessary, how to hide the bleeding parts. She was 38, with a scar that started behind her ear and ran down the canvas of her neck like a ribbon you could only see if you were close enough to notice the pale line. She had a laugh that neighbors in the complex said could run a bright, raw channel through the air, and a drawer full of badges and dust-covered commendations because she never let the paperwork rest long enough. Maya had grown up in a house where silence came cheap and hard. Her father had left with a suitcase and a trail of promises that were always late. Her mother had worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on and had taught Maya to make the kind of list that kept the world from swallowing someone by reminding them to breathe. She learned early that when the world insisted on being unkind, the neatest rebellion was to be a person whose hands were steady. FBI had been an improbable dream, until it wasn't. A life she had fought for with late-night cramming and scholarship forms, and the stubbornness of a girl who watched what happened to people like her and vowed she would be the kind of person who made those injustices stop. It had been a map of small outrages that guided her into the bureau. A neighbor's son taken in a dawn raid for the wrong reasons, a woman at a bus stop who was searched for something no one could define, a teacher who taught math to kids who were already scheduled to be written off. She had wanted, as a young woman, to be a corrective force. The job had given her that power and the cost that comes with it. Long absences from home, a calendar printed in bullet points, a nervous distance in the small ways that matter. None of the ordinary evenings with a kid because she'd been on call. A stakeout running into a week. She had risen in the field because she understood how crimes fit together the way streets do. Undercover work had taught her to walk among men who trusted only themselves and to coax confessions like flowers from choked soil. Criminals learned to fear her because she never let a thread drop. She followed it. Newspapers would later give her nicknames. The woman who turned into the storm. The agent who hunted corruption in places where no one else cared to look. It wasn't vanity that won those names. It was the relentless, exhausting insistence that the law should mean the same thing for everyone. At home, she was a soft world for a small human. Noah, short for something she had chosen because it was sturdy, was 9, with teeth just starting to grow in the front, and a logic as sharp as a new pencil. He liked cereal with too much milk, dinosaurs that could be arranged by the hour, and the precise way she read aloud from books, even when she had not slept. He had watched his mother put on suits and leave at strange hours, and had learned to be proud in a way that sometimes hurt, because he took on other people's looks for her. On days off like this one, she tried on another skin, a woman in a swimsuit who filled her afternoon with small joys a crime scene could not touch. She picked the Maplewood pool because it had an old tree that shaded part of the deck, and a lifeguard named Carmen, who made the best coffee in a paper cup. For an hour, she let the nuclear part of her life go dormant. She let Noah climb the ladder without carefully calculated risk assessments. She let the world shrink to the size of their towels. But the world was not so obliging. The city they lived in had a brittle seam where gentrification and long memories met. There had been protests in the last year about disproportional stops. The police union had grown territorial. Rumors of an informal intel-sharing arrangement between some officers and local dealers had threaded through FBI bulletins like a faint, dangerous whisper. Maya's job in the counter-narcotics task force put her too close to that scent for comfort. She knew faces at the police station she now, in the bright ridiculousness of son and child's screams, could not name aloud without raising the hackles of people who preferred their names quiet. The officers at the pool were known types, not necessarily by face to her at first glance, but by the pattern of their work. There was a young one whose belt seemed too new for his uniform, and whose badge caught the light like an ornament. And there was the older man, a sergeant's jaw that had lost the elasticity of empathy over time. They had been called in for a complaint, they said, a reported hand-to-hand by the lifeguard. The story, like all such stories, wanted a center. That center had landed on the bright red of her swimsuit and the tentative pressure of her 9-year-old's hand. The complaint should have been simple. An officer might have asked questions, taken statements, and left them to their day. But the lens through which the officers looked at her and at the boy was a lens thick with presumption. It was thicker for her because she was a woman of color. In small, exhausting ways, how people read eyes, what they assumed about wealth, who they suspected. The world had set the stage for this conflict to explode. It would flare, fed by old grievances and the hunger for swift, visible action. The moment the baggie appeared, the actors played the parts they had been taught by a system that prized immediate resolution over truth. Word of the arrest zipped through her phone faster than the officers had probably expected. Unknown numbers, a quiet ping from her boss that said simply, "Are you okay?" Her hand trembled when she read it, something she hid because Noah's small face watched for clues. She thought of the agent who had trained her, a man who had told her once that when you wore the bureau on your chest, you had to be ready for every kind of misperception. He had not told her, though, how it felt when the misperception happened to you in public, with your child held where he could not possibly understand the scale of shame. The officers processed the scene with a speed that made it raw. They cuffed her in front of people who had come to Sun, not scandal. The lifeguard hovered, unsure. The women at the card table watched as if this were a movie they could pause. Phones uploaded. The footage, edited, vicious by the internet's standards, would be a lyric soon enough. A black mother arrested at the pool. The headline that would streak across networks hadn't been written yet, but it lurked, a thing waiting for its moment. Maya let them take the cuffs because the alternative, yelling, resisting, turning the child's face into the image of trauma, felt worse. She told no one she would see them in court, and that she would not let an accusation become the end of a career. She would wait for the right time to speak. Inside her, a plan was starting to stitch itself. Agents did not fold easily into visible weakness. They prepared quietly for battle. Back at the station, the officers typed statements with the brisk accuracy of people who believed they had done the right thing. Outside, a few neighbors began to suspect the apparatus behind what they saw. A woman who knew Maya from the PTA recognized her name and called a friend. The first small fissure formed there. Someone who knew her wondered why the officers had jumped to the worst conclusion. At headquarters, her supervisor, Lauren Pierce, felt the sting of contact as a cold vibration in her chest. Lauren called the station with a voice both soft and commanding. "Hold them," she said. "Do not let this be the story the internet makes it." She sent a request through channels that was precise and painless. A request for footage from the pool, call logs, anything that could render the accident into data. It was the start of a tug-of-war between the bright, two-dimensional outrage of social media and the slow, hard arc of evidence. It would be ugly. It would be public. But for now, in the dim fluorescent that smelled like burnt coffee and paperwork, Maya sat with her wrists marked and let herself breathe. She held Noah's small hand, and he looked like someone trying to assemble safety from scraps. His chin was wet with salt and tears. "Mom," he said, and the word was a tether that kept her from spinning. She thought about the men she'd locked up, the dealers who had no face except the one she'd had to make them wear in the courtroom. She thought about the nights someone had tried to burn everything she had built down by slamming her door with men who wanted to frighten her into silence. She thought of her mother's hands and how they had smoothed a dress, not because it looked nice, but because it meant the rest of the day was possible. She knew, intimately, the currency of being underestimated. It had always been in her favor. Until today. The investigation would unspool and tighten. The city would pick sides like fingers on a violin string. Some would call the officer's response appropriate. Others would call it a flag tallied in a long list of wrongs. Both would be right in the ways that hurt most. There are practical truths, and there are moral ones. And today, they were about to rub up against each other like raw wool. What Maya did not know at the moment What the officers had not foreseen amid the cameras and the sunlight was the long catalogue of people she had gathered in her years in the Bureau. She had been careful to keep allies in the right places. She had learned, painfully, that to resist you needed more than righteousness. You needed leverage, witnesses, and a stubborn refusal to let your life be defined by the first narrative thrown at you. She was not a damsel in anyone's frame. She had, over a long work of small and large sacrifices, become someone who could stand in the center of an accusation and watch the world decide what to call her. She had no illusion about how much the system favored certain images, but she had resources, and she had the patient, stubborn belief that truth gathers like water in the low places if you patiently remove the stones that block it. The question was whether, in the glare of public spectacle, there would be time to dismantle a lie and to protect the small, soft thing at her knees. Outside, the video had begun to stitch itself into a narrative. Inside, she began to assemble the counter-argument like a clockmaker putting gears into place. This was not a matter only of clearing her name. It was a matter of preventing a rusted machinery of prejudice from chewing up the police's next unwary victim. And the bag on the sun-warmed towel, the small, pale thing that had done such terrible work, was not simply evidence. It was a trace, a whisper, a seed. She had to know who planted it, and why. Agents are trained to listen for patterns. She listened now, not as a mother who had been wronged, though she was that too, but as a practitioner of a trade that looks for connections where others see chaos. The pool would be the first scene in a story that stretched longer than its sunlit hour. She felt the line begin. This would either be a thing that happened to them, or it would be the beginning of something that changed how the city managed its own people. Her chest cooled with a sharp intention. She would not let this moment stand unchallenged. She folded her fingers around Noah's, and he squeezed back like a compass, finding its true north. In that small pressure, she found the kind of courage you only learn when you are used to carrying other people's safety, and finally realize yours is in the same bag. The first step was to find the origin of the small bag. The second was to understand why two men in uniform thought they could make her disappear with handcuffs and an afternoon's spectacle. The third was to make sure Noah's small heart would not have to learn that the world had to be kind to him before it would allow justice for his mother. There was a larger truth under all of it. This would not be only about Maya Bennett's fight. It would be about a city that had grown comfortable mistaking loudness for righteousness. It would be about the prudence of institutions that hid their rot in procedural language. And it would be about what a mother was willing to endure to keep her child from seeing the world as a place that could take anything from him without reason. She stood, palms tingling where cuffs had dug, and started to plan. The first obstacle was also the most immediate. The video, now online, had turned a private humiliation into a public debate. Comments flickered like fireflies. Sympathy, anger, tribal fury. The police chief released a statement that tried for balance and landed in hollow. The police union called for support for their officers' difficult job. The local news outlet cut the footage into the evening block and fed a line about substance violations that made the bag seem like a century-old sin. Maya called Lauren and then said nothing until Lauren asked, gently, if she could come to the office. The Bureau moved toward procedures like a tidal wave. Policies were read, statements drafted, and a small internal team was assigned to the task of sifting the facts from the frenzy. They sent an agent to get the pool's security footage. They requested the logs from the officers' body cams. But the body cam footage would be an irony. It had been turned off for maintenance at the exact time, the officers said, like a cruel joke on plausibility. Those small seams made her skin prickle with a pattern that had teeth. When she watched the footage the first time, she felt the film of the day pull apart into two layers. On the top, the bright narrative, there was resolution. An arrest in the making. Officers looking like men doing their job. On the bottom layer, the one experts learn to see when they spend years dissecting cases, something moved with a different rhythm. Hands that had lingered near her bag earlier in the day. An unfamiliar man at the edge of the footage whose gait had the ease of someone with business in that place, and the subtle smirk of the officer who would later claim the find. The files started to stitch. An email trail from the station showed that an officer had purchased supplies from a vendor linked to vendors in a known network. Another note, redacted but suggestive, hinted at off-the-books transfers. Once the FBI's internal team dug into the officer's background, they found a thread of small favors and suspiciously timed welfare checks that aligned with drug drop times in neighborhoods that had been quieted only by fear. The more they looked, the more it felt like a house whose supports had been quietly eaten by termites. Maya's reputation did not simply rest on her work. It rested on the knowledge that she had made enemies who were unafraid of the police stations and their quiet back rooms. She had closed down labs, put men with names back into cells, and in doing so she had made more than one person desperate enough to try to take something from her. If someone had wanted to shatter her publicly and do it in a way that also sent a message to anyone who might follow her example, they would plant a moment precisely like this, obvious and cruel. She could feel the focus narrowing, a type of cold that sharpened her attention. The Bureau had to move with care. They were not just uncovering a local incident. They were tracing a path that might lead to a larger rot. For that to happen, they needed a chain of custody, witnesses, surveillance, and a well-executed sting that would not let the corrupt officers know they were being watched until the moment of revelation. Noah, too, became a stakeholder in ways that made her not only furious, but careful. He would need therapy to process this image of his mother being turned into spectacle. He would need friendship, reassurance, and the knowledge that the adults around him were competent protectors. She made arrangements for his immediate safety, relying on a neighbor who knew them both, and on the quiet kindness of the PTA moms who had once rallied against a budget cut. For Maya, the rising action of the next days was not only an arc of professional procedure, it was an emotional gauntlet. Each new clip online made the incision deeper. People who did not know her questioned her judgment. How could she be a mother and an agent? And those who did know her worried about what this would do to a child who trusted the world less every day. The smear attempts pulled at the tenderest part of her identity, the promise to keep Noah safe and to show him how to push back against injustice with dignity. They tracked the man who appeared at the edge of the footage. He was a small-time courier named Luis, but his route intersected with a larger web. When they began tracing calls connected to the officers, they found a string of numbers linked to a dealer named Silas Monroe, a man on whom Maya had worked last year. Silas had lost a shipment, and the theory the team tried on felt like a heavy glove. What if he planted the bag to distract attention from a higher volume transfer? What if, worse, someone at the PD was shielding those operations in exchange for a cut? The seeds of corruption were stubborn. You only needed a few rotten grains to seed a whole field. At the center of the tension was the idea that officers might be actively lying to cover for a deal. For someone like Maya, who had built a career exposing such lies, the possibility felt familiar and enraging. To be accused for something one had spent years fighting was a narrative crueler than any fiction. It became in the working of the team, a test of whether institutions would protect their own at all costs, or whether accountability had any teeth. The social media storm contorted the truth into sharper edges. Petitions appeared calling for the officers to be honored. Others called for immediate suspension. People lit smoky candles of outrage in front of the pool and of the station simultaneously. News vans arrived and parked like beetles that would not leave. The city council demanded answers. The mayor issued tepid remarks about due process. The internet, like a hungry mouth, chewed and spat out pieces of the day, clips cut short, angles that made the officers look like heroes, angles that painted Maya as guilty. At night, in the strange, quiet hours of the bureau, Maya sat beside Lauren and watched evidence that was less drama and more accounting. Lauren promised to keep the case moving. "We will get the footage, the receipts, and a chain of custody," she said. "We'll show the public what the officers didn't want them to see." They set the bait. Maya, though she wanted nothing more than to crawl into a bed and wake up to the world righted, agreed to perform a sequence that required more cunning than courage. She would go back to the neighborhood where Silas operated under controlled conditions. They would plant a sting that would capture the transfer, video, and, most importantly, the person who could link the officers to the ring. A plan of this kind needed secrecy and the proper kind of deception. Maya found herself returning to a life she had often tried to leave at the door. Days bled into preparation. Surveillance, the quiet purchase of prepaid phones tracked by the Bureau, and messaging through secure lines. She arranged cover for Noah so he could not be used as a bargaining chip or a tool of shame in the viral frenzy. The week progressed like a drum roll. Every call she fielded was threaded with tension. Friends that she thought of as lifelong contacts kept their distance because the optics were messy. Allies offered cautious support. She began to feel the loneliness that comes with being a public figure wronged. You are both shield and target. The sting, when it came, was a choreography of precision. Maya sat in an unremarkable car with a teammate who watched the rear view like a hawk. The phone in her pocket was wired to Lauren. The streetlight lined the curb, and the air smelled faintly of late garbage and gasoline. She felt a strange tightness, a moment before a dive, and recalled the look on her son's face at the pool, the way the world had turned in a single afternoon. The meeting was a small thing, a transfer at a corner store that paid no mind to the men in suits watching. The courier arrived, a man with the same gait as the man in the footage. The officers were late, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. Silence stacked into an anger that was hard and pressed against the sternum. Then, as if from nowhere, a car peeled up and parked. Two men in plain clothes stepped out, arms folded, faces closed. One gave a nod. The handoff started. That's when the sting unfolded. The backup moved in, sirens muffled at first, then insistent, forms of justice arriving with the sound of authority. Men who thought themselves hidden, men who had wrapped themselves in the protection of uniform, found for the first time in a while that not everyone owed the same favors. In the sweep of events, it was a professional success. Warrants executed, packages inventoried, evidence sealed. But justice is not only a technical thing. It is also reputation. That's when the chain began to reveal itself. In the pouches of the courier they found transfer ledgers, names inked in slanted hand, and among them a notation that placed an officer's badge number in the margin. Proof, crude and undeniable, of a link between the police and the dealers. The dirty officer was not the one who had framed her at the pool, at least not directly. But the ledger's columns connected names to times and amounts in a way that, when stitched together, made a map of favors and purchases. The officers who had arrested her were involved at a level that made the whole city tremble. The sting revealed spiders under the rugs. Word of the bust breathed life into the team. Newspapers that had initially run with the arrest became more cautious. The police force, prodded by an internal affairs probe, found itself facing a story that could no longer be reduced to a single afternoon by the pool. The officers who had grabbed her that day now had to explain transactions in writing and in court. Their initial confidence, which had been bolstered by the crowd at the pool, cracked like thin glass. But this was not yet victory. The city's institutions were not wholly prepared to punish their own. Union lawyers stepped in with protective language. Internal investigations slogged. The officers who had been quick to arrest her cultivated a narrative of their own. They had done their duty. The public, hungry for simple answers, flitted between sympathy and skeptics like a fickle audience. Maya's nights were spent both exhausted and awake with memory. She could not unsee the shame in her son's eyes. She could not unsay the look on the face of the officer who had first pulled the bag from her tote. But she had the ledger now, and that, more than anything, was the needle that could lay a thread across the gossip and down into the kind of proof her enemies could not spin away. The timing of the next steps had to be precise. The Bureau planned to present the evidence in a way that would make the officer's culpability undeniable, enough to force public action without creating a spectacle they could not control. Yet there was also a smaller, fiercer need that rose from her chest. A woman's need for personal exoneration and for the boy who had watched the sun set on his mother in cuffs. She wanted, more fiercely than justice, for him to see his mother stand without the weight of public shame. Near midnight, with rain like a low drumming on the windows, Maya sat in her kitchen with the ledger under a lamp and called her mother. She told her, finally, what had happened. Her mother's voice was a slow, solid thing. "You did what you needed," she said. "Now, do the rest. For Noah." The plan they built after that had the neatness of a carefully folded paper airplane. Document, arrest, expose, protect. It was not glamorous. It was not a cinematic reveal of badge and badge alone. It was slow, methodical, and legal. The Bureau, with the ledger and the footage and the couriers now speaking under pressure, had enough for warrants. The city's internal affairs, pressured by the possibility of an ugly public relations fallout, cooperated. The pieces moved into place. The day authority moved to talk publicly was the day the city nearly stopped breathing. Reporters crowded around the courthouse like winter flies. Cameras angled for a close shot of her face. Her son sat behind her, small as a truth. The officers arrived with a swagger that tried to pretend they had not been quoted in a ledger. It fell apart like a bad joke by the time the heavy-hearted stack of evidence hit the table. Special Agent Lauren Pierce read out charges in a voice that did not try to be theatrical. It was lawful and cold and precise. Counts, timelines, corroborations. She laid out the ledger and its ties to the officers. She showed the timeline, the transfer of funds, the CCTV that placed the courier with the ledger where it could be seen. She watched the officers watch their own undoing. And then it was time for the small public part that would find its way into the city's memory. A room full of people. Press cameras pointing like accusatory fingers. And two officers who had turned a woman into a spectacle, being forced to see the scale of what they had done. They looked less like heroes than like men caught on the underside of their own choices. One of them, the younger, could not meet Maya's eyes. The other, older, had a look of someone who had counted on the small silences of people like her and was now numb with something resembling regret. When the microphones moved toward her, when the cameras asked her to speak so they could stitch the day into something they could broadcast, Maya did not read a script. She did not look for grand redemption. She spoke simply, with the steel of someone who had waited long enough. "I am a mother," she said, and her voice carried in the cramped air. "I am an agent. No woman should be made a warning because of who she is. We are not objects to be used in somebody else's narrative." The sound of that sentence did not so much make the officers afraid as it made the room tilt into a recognition that some line had been crossed. The ledger, the footage, and the testimony were enough. The officers were charged, suspended, and eventually indicted. The dealer network folded under pressure and, in plea deals and testimonies, pointed fingers at those who had protected them. Yet beyond the legalities, the revelation that she was a federal agent cut a different kind of swath through the city. It was not simply that people were shocked that she had been an agent. It was that they had been reminded how quickly visibility could be weaponized and how thin the buffer of presumed innocence can be for women of color. The officers who had once presumed they could humiliate a woman in front of her child found themselves facing consequences for that presumption. They learned, the way men sometimes learn too late, that there are lines you cannot cross without a reckoning. The fallout was messy. The police department lost trust in the eyes of many citizens. The union railed and fought the indictments like a cornered animal. There were hearings that scraped at the edges of the question, how much is individual prejudice responsible, and how much is system design complicit? The city council convened panels that talked about training, body cams, and the dark art of cultural competency. But it was not enough. Those conversations, helpful as they were, needed to be followed by sustained action. For Maya, the resolution was not merely legal. She had, finally, her name restored in the narrow and practical sense of law. More importantly, she had shown her son the exact shape of courage that mattered, not the kind that shouted from headlines, but the kind that did the hard, exhausting mathematics required to make sure unjust men could not simply keep replicating themselves. Noah understood the contours of the story at the level his age allowed him. He knew that some people had tried to hurt them because of who they were. He knew his mother had not only fought back, but had used the tools the law had given her to protect them both. He learned, in small, child-sized increments, that the world sometimes dealt in sharp edges, but that the right people could wield institutions like shields. There would be therapy, of course, and nights when he would ask questions without fully knowing why they mattered. Maya answered them with a mixture of honesty and the small white lies children need to sleep. She also faced a different kind of aftermath, the relentless adjustment of a career that had always required sacrifices. She thought often about the men and women in the bureau who had supported her and those who had not. She thought about the officers who had done their jobs honorably and were now lumped with those who had not. She started speaking publicly in quiet ways, panels about accountability, workshops in community centers, and small groups where parents could learn their rights. She used what she had learned to change policy where she could, and to fight for better systems of oversight. She filed the report that would be etched into the department's record. She sat with her son on couches, with therapists' soft lighting, and spoke about the thin line between being visible and being vulnerable. She taught him to speak up and to remember people who might not have an orchestra of supporters around them. She taught him, finally, that their name was not something that could be stolen easily. The indictment of the officers left residue, as such events always do. Some people would continue to believe the initial viral narrative. Some would never be convinced that a woman's words could outweigh a picture. There were those who would call her things in the privacy of anonymous social media accounts. But the ledger, the tapes, and the confessions had been enough to peel away the surface of presumption and reveal a number of rot. Maya tried not to let the bitterness settle in her bones. The more dangerous thing was to let it harden into something that would make her eyes less forgiving. Instead, she channeled the energy into work that mattered. Better training protocols, greater transparency in police-dealer interactions, and community outreach that centered both protection and dignity. She became a small, fierce voice for reform, the kind that did not demand headlines but produced a steady shift. In quiet moments, however, the story returned like a tide. She would find herself looking at a playground where children chased each other and thinking about the day her son's trust had been tested by a moment he could not understand. She would wake at 2 in the morning and rehearse what she would say if she encountered the officer on the street. Anger was not a helpful companion for life, but it was a necessary one in the courtroom of change. In the aftermath, she received messages from women who wrote about being stopped by officers for no reason, from parents who feared their children would be next. She answered as many as she could, with candor and with the precise kind of counsel that comes from someone who had walked into the toils of both the law and motherhood and come out with a map. She taught, she testified, and she pushed. The city did not become perfect overnight, but the conversation had shifted enough that the new officers coming through the academy could no longer assume a blank canvas when they looked at a woman like her. One evening, months after the sun heat had become a memory and the pool deck was quiet, Maya walked with Noah to the same place they had been the day the cameras rose. The tree shaded the bench the way it had before. She watched him as he studied a stick, as if constructing a civilization from a single shard of wood. She breathed in a long, slow breath and felt the residue of the city's strangeness settle into something less jagged. "Are you okay?" he asked casually, like a boy who had been given more truth than he could carry in one breath. She smiled in a way that felt generous and tired at once. "I am," she said. "We're okay." He leaned into her like he had when he was small and sick, and in that small crease of contact, she understood the arc of what had happened. They had been embarrassed, wronged, then vindicated. They had seen the thinness of public opinion and the thickness of the law when it chose to act justly. They had done their work, and were left with the residue of knowing how fragile fairness could be. She had earned her son a safer story, and, in doing so, had pushed the city a little further from the edge where assumptions curled into injustice. The crooked officers had been exposed, the dealers had been prosecuted, and the ledger had been a small, stubborn thing that changed a course. The work would not end. Systems do not transform in a moment. But in the space between sun and shade, between a mother and a child, she felt that the world had shifted a fraction in the direction of rightness. She had been accused at a pool in a moment that could have defined them. Instead, she had turned the accusation into a catalyst. The most feared agent, as some headlines would call her, always ironically, she had thought, had simply been a woman who refused to let a lie stand. Fear is dull when it is simply a rumor. The true fear, the one that matters, is in the knowledge that the law can find its teeth if those who see injustice decide to use them. As the sun dipped lower, Maya thought of the families who would watch the news and think, "That could have been us." She thought of the children who needed to know that when the world sees a woman in a red swimsuit, its first thought must not be a bag of drugs. She thought of the oath she had taken, and of the small, essential promise she had made to a 9-year-old with dinosaur socks and a capacity for joy. The story would be told in chapters. The arrest, the sting, the ledger, the courtroom, the policy changes, the therapy. People would clip the best lines and broadcast them as proof of their positions. But the truth she carried was quieter and more useful. It was a story of endurance and the stubborn insistence that systems are only as just as the people who hold them accountable. "Remember," she told Noah as they walked, "you can cry when you need to. You can be angry, but when you can, use what you have to help others." He looked up at her, that small, sure look of a child who believed his mother could hold the world in her hands. "Like the ledger?" he asked. "Exactly like the ledger," she said, and the two of them walked back toward their small life, toward the normality they had been fighting for. Simple dinners, homework, dinosaur battles. The city would continue to hum with its complicated life. But in a small recorded file, there was now a ledger and a tape, and a woman's voice that had not been silenced. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be a note of insistence. When the world hands you an ugly narrative, dig for the ledger. Where there are quick judgments, look for the paperwork that reveals the truth. And when you can, stand up, not only for yourself, but for those who have not yet found the breath to speak. If you saw the video at the pool, if you felt that prickle of moral confusion, ask yourself what you would have done. Would you have reached for your phone, your words, your outrage? Would you have scrolled on or stayed? The smallest actions can redirect a life. Share this story if it matters to you. Tell others to look beyond the first frame. Subscribe to keep listening to stories that demand more than a headline. And to remind yourself that justice is a work that requires more than one voice.